All right, guys. Thank you for all for attending. It's about 7:02 here on the East Coast. I will keep admitting those who come in a little later. Everybody knows me. I'm Peter. I'm the vice president of the chapter. I don't see any of my other board members on here by now. Oh, there's John. John Burbridge is here from Pennsylvania. So before we get into tonight's presentation, let me just go over a few upcoming things. One, anyone who wants to contribute to the newsletter needs to get an article in by Valentine's Day, sent to Ruth Sadler. Hopefully we'll have that out by the end of February. Secondly, the Babe Ruth Museum's virtual program this year, Birthday Bash, will be February 23rd to 25th. I'll blast everybody about that when the nights are set. It's going to be free to the general public. And there will be 3 programs on baseball out of 4. The other one will be on the University of Maryland sports, 2 on the Orioles, and 1 on a panel on Babe Ruth. And our next Baltimore meeting will be, usually would be the 17th, would be the 3rd Wednesday, but because that's Ash Wednesday this month, we're going to move it to the 24th, and it'll be Dan Taylor, who I believe is in our Sacramento or San Francisco chapter. I have to get that right. Will be talking about his book, Lights, Camera, Fastball, The Hollywood Stars Changed Baseball. And once again, you have to register in advance. When we're using the National SABR account, they want everybody to register so they can track. So you'll be seeing those links from here on out. And guess that's it from my end. We also are going to start at the end of this month, the last Sunday of the month, just a free-for-all baseball talk. I kind of stole the idea from the Connie Mack chapter. They do one actually weekly. We'll do it the last Sunday evening of every month, and if it turns out to be pretty good, we'll do it from 7 to 9 and chit chat. I won't record those because those will just kind of be a free-for-all. I won't have any real academic basis. But just give us another chance to commiserate during this miserable pandemic time. RJ, I'm going to let him take over. I know he's from a native of Pennsylvania. I think he's still in Carlisle. It's my home state. So his resume speaks for himself. So I'll let him introduce himself, and he will share his presentation, hopefully, with us. I've made him a co-host. And with that, take it over.
Well, thank you, and thanks for having me. I moved to Pennsylvania in August of 2014 after being in Iowa for a number of years, where I was involved with the Field of Dreams chapter, but enjoying my time in Pennsylvania so far, and looking forward to doing more things Pennsylvania related as we go. This, well, let me share my screen. So we'll be talking about what it's like to be young and a giant, the famous phrase coined by Larry Doyle, or was it? We'll get to that in a moment. But Larry Doyle, who was the team captain, he's standing 4th from the left here. Was famous for saying, "Oh, it's great to be young and a giant," which was later adapted to, "Oh, it's great to be young and a Yankee" by Waite Hoyt, and later on by Michael Keaton in the movie, oh gosh, what was the name of the movie? But "Oh, it's great to be young and insane." But great, so is it great to be young and a giant? Well, one of the things that I'm fascinated by this team, obviously this is a team that had success during its run from 1911 through 1913, won the National League pennant, and on the surface it looks like they won those pennants fairly convincingly. 7.5 games in 1911, 10 games in 1912, etc. It wasn't quite that easy, and one of the things I find intriguing as I look at this team is the ups and downs throughout the season, just as any baseball season we can think of. The other thing everybody knows about this team is that they also lost the World Series each of those 3 years, twice to the Philadelphia Athletics and once to the Boston Red Sox in in both of those, in the 1911 and 1912 series in particular, there are a number of famous stories that we'll talk about in a moment. But a lot of that is the sort of thing anybody can find in any history of baseball or any baseball encyclopedia or any online source. So how does one go beyond that and get into what I think are some of the more interesting stories? I started looking at this back in an almost embarrassingly long time ago. One day, it was actually Labor Day weekend, 1993. I was rereading The Glory of Their Times by Lawrence Ritter, which I'm struck by when I read this in particular. I'd read it as a teenager, but I hadn't looked at it in a number of years. So I was struck as I was looking at this by how many stories there were about this particular Giants team. There's, of course, 5 players from that team. Rube Marquard, Fred Snodgrass have figured prominently. John Tortes Myers, who is probably my favorite player of all time, certainly somebody I would love to have a beer with. If I could have a beer with anybody, he would be on the short list, even though he was a teetotaler and didn't drink. Al Bridwell and Heine Groh, who were with the team for a short period, also had chapters in that book. But what struck me as interesting too is how many of the players I talked about just now, Marquard, Snodgrass, Bridwell, Myers, really liked playing for John McGraw, the manager of the Giants, which is interesting because in an interesting contrast with other chapters in that same book. Ritter also interviewed, for example, Ed Roush and Bob O'Farrell, who just hated playing for McGraw later on in the late 20s. Why is that? What happened? What changed between in the 15 years intervening? So I started going to the library, started reading everything I could about the team, and found out that a lot of the stories that you typically hear about the team are interesting, but left a lot to be desired in terms of completeness. So I started I was attending the University of Minnesota at the time. Had gone back to school to finish my bachelor's degree, and they had a phenomenal microfilm collection. So I was going through the microfilm of the New York Times and New York American, New York, all the World, all of the papers that were covering the Giants at the time, and just diving into what it was like to walk through 1911, 1912, etc. Joined SABR a few years later because I read an article in Baseball Weekly that Stu Thornley had presented a paper at the convention that year about the Polo Grounds. And I thought, oh, well, people are digging into the same sorts of things I'm digging into, so I think I want to be a member of this. I ended up contributing bios of 6 of the members of this team to the Dead Ball Stars first volume. As I was going through making use of SABR's resources, the lending library and so forth, to the point where I was annoying Eileen Canapari, who was working in the SABR office at the time, because I was, she would say, "Are you going to return that microfilm?" It's like, "Oh, I just need it one more week, honest, just one more week." Really, RJ? Okay, so made my first Cooperstown trip in 2007. Life got in the way for a few years, but got back into it eventually. And now, since I'm stuck at home, it's time to, I think, try to finish whatever project I think I'm doing here. Try to get something done with it, make the most of this time. Whoops. Here we go. So the 1911 New York Giants. Most people know this, but for those, I suspect everybody here knows this. 347 stolen bases, a team record that still stands. They had a phenomenal September road trip where they pretty much nailed down the pennant. I think they were in first place when they left, but the 1904 trip pretty much nailed it down. And it was a phenomenal road trip, wonderful stories. This is where the story of Charles Victor Faust, or Victory Faust, comes in. He was the fellow who believed that a fortune teller had told him that if he pitched for the Giants, they'd win the pennant. So the Giants took him around with them as a good luck charm. And in particular, the Giants all caught fire, but in particular, Rube Marquard really established himself as a pitcher that year and really took the Faust good luck charm thing seriously, because he found another level while Faust was with the team. The 1911 World Series, of course, is famous for Home Run Baker hitting 2 iconic home runs in that series, one off of Marquard, one off of Christy Mathewson. Often forgotten is that if you were going to say who was the MVP of the 1911 World Series, you'd probably say Baker. But you could make a good case for Charlie Bender, who pitched 3 games, went head-to-head against Mathewson twice, split those, and then on 2 days rest, pitched the game 6 game. Excuse me. And basically, other than a sort of a scratch run early and an unnecessary run late, Bender was pretty much unhittable during that game and pretty much owned the Giants otherwise. This was the game that had, or the World Series that had the 6-day rain delay in the middle of it, where everybody's cooling their heels, waiting for the Shibe Park in Philadelphia the field to be dry enough so that they can actually play on it. And the potential classic, what could have been a Merkel or Snodgrass moment when in Game 5, when the walk-off run didn't actually, when Larry Doyle was trying to score the walk-off run, he actually didn't touch the plate. Everybody stormed onto the field as they were wont to do in those days, and the only people who noticed it were John McGraw and umpire Bill Clem. But since the Athletics didn't protest the decision at the plate, but just walked off, the game went to the Giants. It didn't matter because the Athletics pretty much nailed it down the next day anyway. The 1912 season, this is one of those things where everyone says, oh, well, the pennant race was pretty much over by July, because the Giants got off to a fantastic start. Pretty much by July 4th, they did have a massive lead in the pennant race. What's often overlooked, though, is that they went into a swoon in July and August. And by end of August, their lead was down to about 5 games. It could have been a choke of along on the scale of 1951 or even 1914, which would happen, obviously at the hands of the Miracle Braves 2 years later. But it didn't. Eventually, Marquard had his 19-game winning streak during the first half of the season, but was sort of below a 500 pitcher after that. But rookie Jeff Tesreau, who had mastered his spitball by then, had a phenomenal second half of the season, including a no-hitter in September, and basically picked up the slack. So the Giants were able to hold off challenges, build their lead back up, and coast to the pennant eventually. This was the World Series, famous for, famous for Fred Snodgrass's dropped fly ball and the collapse that the Giants had in Game 8. Often overlooked in the World Series is Game 2. There were ended as a 6-6 tie after 12 innings. There were 5 unearned runs as a result of 5 Giants errors. Any one of those errors isn't made, and the Giants win the game. And then Fred Snodgrass's obituary is kind of dull, right? But the Giants did come back to force the last game, and unfortunately, that's what Snodgrass is remembered for. As some of you may know, one of my areas of interest is baseball players who appeared on the vaudeville circuit, and Marquard, who was appearing that off-season with Blossom Seeley. There's a very juicy scandal here because Seeley was married to a producer named Joe Kane at the time. And Marquardt and Seeley ended up sort of falling in love with each other while they were doing this show. And there's a sort of a comic opera moment where they're caught in a hotel room and have to sneak out the fire escape, and yeah, it's the sort of thing you would expect out of a situation comedy. So those sorts of things are interesting. But again, most of these things are again, as I'm saying, not something that is that hard to find, either from the books that are written or anything like that. The 1913 season was pretty dull by comparison, except that what's interesting for me in the 1913 season is not what's going on with the Giants so much as what's going on with the Phillies. The Phillies are managed by Red Doyon, who had been at the point of quitting several times when Horace Fogel was the Philadelphia owner. When Fogel was ousted by the rest of the league and William Locke took over as the Phillies president, Doyon was like a new man, because Locke basically said, "You're in charge, you take control, you do it." And the Phillies just came out swinging. They had a good team, but never could quite get over the top. They were doing phenomenally. At some point, however, I suspect people knew it probably couldn't last, but what really killed the Phillies that year was the death of Locke later that summer. And that kind of took the heart out of Doyon and out of the Phillies. So they kind of faded after the end. Excuse me. I mentioned there the August 30 game. That would probably deserve a whole presentation in and of itself, because it's interesting in that it could have been, again, another Merkel game type of scandal. There was a game that was forfeited by umpire Bill Brennan to the Giants because the fans in the center field of the Phillies ballpark were distracting the Giants batters by waving hats and straw hats and wearing white shirts and things like that. And when the fans refused to stop this behavior, Brennan forfeited the game to the Giants. And this created a massive stir. And it was eventually ruled that they would have to pick up the game from where they left off the next time the Giants. Sounds a lot like the Merkel game in 1908, except that by the time they did actually replay the game, Philadelphia was far enough behind that nobody really cared. So the game was allowed to play out to its conclusion and resolved without the mayhem that surrounded the 1908 situation. Same sort of thing, same sort of deal in 1913. Again, the Giants lose the World Series. Christy Mathewson and Eddie Plank, shown here, had two great pitchers duels. Mathewson winning the first one, Plank winning the clincher in Game 5. Home Run Baker had another great World Series. The Giants did have some injuries to key players, particularly Fred Merkle at first base. They ended up putting Hooks Wiltz, who was a very good fielding pitcher, in at first base, and Wiltz had a memorable game, killing a couple of Athletics rallies in Game 2. But again, these are the sorts of things everybody knows or can find pretty easily. What I find interesting are stories like Stanley Bates. Now you're saying, who? Well, as you can see right there, he's a former baseball player with the New York Giants. This is from his obituary in 1950. He had a very successful life for the most part. He inherited a plumbing business from his father. His father was the mayor of Quincy, Massachusetts, and Bates had a reasonably successful political career, as his obituary says, former state representative. But there it is, right in the middle, former baseball player with the New York Giants. 3 paragraphs, and that's prominently in the middle of it. Well, what's the story about that? You're probably, if you're going to go look at a roster of the 1911 to 13 Giants, you're not going to find him. There's a reason for that, and we'll get to that in a moment. But what I find interesting are the players here that we that pass as I'm reading the newspapers from 1911, et cetera, and especially things like spring training, and really finding myself intrigued. And this is probably why this project has taken way longer than it really needs to. But I find myself intrigued by some of the stories of the players and other personnel who passed through the organization during this period. I've identified 120 persons of interest who were with the organization during this period. So that's the whole list. You know, read fast. No, I'm kidding. 48 of these persons of interest played in at least one major league regular season game for the Giants during these years. So there are the obvious ones like Christy Mathewson, of course, the great Hall of Famer, John Myers, the catcher, etc. Jim Thorpe, who was probably the most famous athlete in the world at the time after the 1912 Stockholm Olympics, signed to play baseball with the Giants in 1913. You had also at the other extreme, you had players like Joe Evers, Johnny Evers' brother, who entered one game as a pinch runner, and that was his only major league appearance ever. You had players like Art Devlin, great third baseman, but who was basically on his way out. You had Mike Donlin, who came out of retirement to play baseball again, hoping to have one final hurrah, and really not having that. You had up-and-coming players like Hank Gowdy and Dick Rudolph, who didn't do anything, who were traded away from the Giants, so they weren't notable for what they did with the Giants, but again, they were key players on that Miracle Braves team that came along 2 years later, or 3 years later. But these guys you can pretty much look up in any baseball encyclopedia and get their stories. Now there are in the green ink here, there are another 22 people I identified as so far that are employees of the Giants. And this includes obviously John McGraw, the manager, and the coaches, Wilbert Robinson, Arlie Latham, et cetera. But it also includes the executives, the team owner, the treasurer, directors of the Giants, the scouts who worked for the Giants and helped McGraw sign some of the prospects that were on these teams. Ticket sellers. Not often that ticket sellers get a lot of attention, but given that both the 1911 and 1912 World Series were marked by ticket scalping scandals, the papers are full of who the ticket sellers were for both the Giants and the Athletics and Red Sox for both of those years. So basically, there were probably more ticket sellers than just the guys listed here, but like Richard Donovan. But he made the papers because he was canned as a result of his alleged part in the scandal. Some of these guys actually did get into ball games during the season, not during regular season games, but as fill-ins during exhibition games. Eddie Brannick, the assistant secretary, was a fairly young man at the time and liked to get into the ball games. And McGraw basically told him, forget about being a ball player and you might amount to something. And he did. He stayed of all of the men on this list, they're all men. Brannick was the last one to leave the Giants. He actually followed the Giants to San Francisco, when they moved to San Francisco, and stayed with them for over a decade after that. So he was a long tenured employee with the club. But that still leaves all the fellas in black, and I will bring those forward here. So we have 50 players, and these are all players. Who were these guys? So as I mentioned, some of these names just kept coming up, and you're reading the newspaper in 1911, or I'm reading a newspaper from March 1911, and it's talking about, oh, this guy had a great game against Dallas during this exhibition game, et cetera. And you're thinking, well, what happened to the guy? I find that I find this intriguing for some reason, and to some extent, I'm probably spending more on that than the stuff anybody else would really care about. But we come back to Stanley Bates. So, did Bates ever play with the Giants? Well, no. He had a trial with the Giants in April of 1913. So he didn't go to spring training even with them, and didn't get into any, as far as I can tell, any games with them. But he did get a trial after he had been spending a couple of years playing baseball in Canada, where he met his wife, Charlotte. The Canada stint from earlier is not shown here on the contract card, but I was able to find some evidence that he did play in Canada, and again, that's how he met his wife. So that's good for him. So, but the Sporting News contract card, as you can see, does not show any entry for the New York Giants, indicating that there was never a contract signed. So why care? Well, obviously it was important enough to him to talk about it, and for his family to include it in the obituary. And this is not unusual. We've all heard stories about, oh, my grandpa was with the Cardinals or whatever, and you go to find out they weren't with the Cardinals. But sometimes, in many cases, the fellows who were had some contact with the Giants actually carried that through the rest of their lives, and we're very proud of the fact that even just for a moment, they had that taste of the big time. And Bates was obviously one of those. Another intriguing story is a fellow named Ray Andrews. I don't have any photographs of some of these people, and this is one guy who really intrigues me. He was a semi-pro pitcher from Denver. He was invited to spring training as a favor to Andrews's father. I have no idea what the relationship was between McGraw and Andrews's father, or even what Andrews's father's name was. All I know is that this was mentioned in at least 2 articles that I've seen. I don't have a lot of specifics about Andrews, but I was able to follow the trail between this Andrews, the semi-pro pitcher from Denver, and the Andrews who pitched in the International League and Western League with Denver through 1916. What's interesting there is that here there's an interesting thing. So in spring of 1917, Andrews signs a contract with Denver, who he had pitched for in 1916. In July of 1917, a pitcher named Ray Andrews becomes the manager of the La Crosse, Wisconsin ball club in the Central Association. Now, it seems highly likely to me that this is the same guy, but I haven't yet been able to connect the dots. I'm still working on that one, but I would like to be able to connect the La Crosse, Wisconsin Andrews with the Denver Andrews. I also know that the La Crosse Ray Andrews enlists in the Navy for World War I, and then after that I lose the trail. So I would love to know what happened to the guy after this. I just find this intriguing. Probably more so than I should. If I'm ever going to finish this research, which I may never, who knows, because I just find stuff like this interesting. One of the most bizarre stories is a fellow by the name of Frank Forsythe, whose nickname was Cy. I think that the Cy comes from his last name, Forsythe. But this picture from the New York Herald labeled him as Synthus. I don't know why. The sports writers of the time liked to make fun of players' names in a sense. Richard Marquard was often referred to as De Marquise in the New York Times for reasons that were probably funny at the time. I don't know, but anyway, Forsythe was a very good hitter. He came to spring training. He was drafted from the Pekin team of the Illinois-Missouri League. He had hit 380 with them, which, as Crash Davis said in Bull Durham, is a career in any league. So he got some interest. The Giants drafted him, brought him to spring training 1911, and spring training, this was the player that really got me interested in what happened to whatever happened to these guys, because he was hitting the ball really well. He was playing really well. And there's a lot of speculation that Forsythe was going to be one of the players to stick with the Giants, but he never made it to New York. Before the Giants left Texas, they sold his contract to Dallas, where he played for the 1911 season. He was a member of, he moved around a little bit. He was a member of the Omaha Western League champions, the 1916 pennant winners. And this is where it gets bizarre. He goes back home. His wife had passed away, leaving their young son. And before he went off to Omaha to start the 1916 season, he left his son in the care of some friends of his who lived in Topeka, where he was living. So when he went back to Topeka after the season was over, he found that the family had moved and not told anyone where they were going, and had taken his son with them. I don't know all of the details here, but I can tell you that Forsythe did not play in 1917. And that could have been war-related, but it also could have been that he was trying to find his son. He does eventually return to baseball in 1918 in the Pacific Coast League. He ends up, after his playing days are over, he becomes he works in a hospital in Napa, in the Napa area, and lives there for many years. And one day he's reading the newspaper and he sees a face of a man who has been arrested for second-degree murder, and he recognizes his son immediately. He tracks down, even though he hasn't seen his son since the son was a little boy, he says, no, that's him. It's got to be him. I recognize him. So he goes and finds out, sure enough, this was the boy who had been taken from him in 1916. So Forsythe stays with his son throughout the trial. His son is convicted of the crime and goes to prison. Forsythe spends the rest of his life working, as a hospital administrator, and his obituary, I was able to find enough evidence to connect the dots to prove that the obituary I had was him. And interestingly, his obituary does not mention his baseball playing career and does not mention the Giants. And I suspect some of the tragic events involving his son had something to do with that. Thomas Hanley was a young pitcher whose contract had been purchased the previous year. He was invited to spring training in 1913, but dies of appendicitis during spring training. It was an unfortunate story, and it's one of those things that I'm always mindful of when people talk about, is it harder to play baseball now, or is it harder to play baseball back then? It's like, well, for me, anytime you go back to a time when there wasn't penicillin or basic medical care, I think I'd say it was harder then, personally. Giants played an exhibition game in Youngstown, Ohio in the middle of the season for the benefit of Hanley's widow and children, and raised quite a fair amount of money for that. Although people in Youngstown were upset that even though Jim Thorpe was there, they wanted to see Mathewson, and Mathewson didn't make the trip to Youngstown. So people were a little bit upset about that. This I'll just point out, because again, this is another one of those things probably that isn't of a lot of interest to people except obsessive compulsive people like me. But I found this picture of dignitaries waiting for the first game of the 1912 World Series to start. And two of the prominent figures are over here. Mayor Fitzgerald of Boston, John F. Kennedy's grandfather, and Mayor Gaynor of New York. Over here on the end is John Whalen, who was the treasurer of the Giants at the time. Interesting thing about Whalen is that he had a fairly significant, he was chairman of the Board of Education in New York for a number of years. He had a fairly significant political and legal career. But when I found this picture, it was mislabeled, or I shouldn't say it was labeled as that he was the New York Secretary of State. And I thought, well, that's interesting. I hadn't found that in any of the information I'd read about John Whalen. It turns out that there was another John Whalen significant in New York politics at the time. This was John Sibley Whalen. Our John Whalen here did not have a middle name as far as I can tell, but John Sibley Whalen was a significant political figure, again, Secretary of State for New York at about the same time, 1907, 1908, in that period. Which is one of the pitfalls of doing baseball research. Sometimes you get to, sometimes it becomes very difficult to sort these names and these players out. For example, over here on my list of people I'm looking at, there are two guys named Smith, or are they? It's the name Smith, how can you tell? A number of these players have great stories behind them as well, but as far as their baseball careers, the one name you might recognize is Baby Doll Jacobson, who went on to play with the St. Louis Browns for a number of years. Obviously, had a good career, but outside of his experience with the Giants, he came to spring training with the Giants, didn't stick on with them, but eventually made good. But I find some of these, and there are a couple of players here that I'd really love to know more about, and they're right next to each other, Charles DePay and Jesse Edens, who both were high school students in Marlin, who ended up putting on a Giants uniform because the Giants were stuck for players for an exhibition game. So these high school kids who just happened to be working out, the high school team was getting to work out with the Giants a little bit and just happened to get into a game. Isn't that anybody's fantasy, right? You're sitting there and somebody says, hey, sign that kid up, well, at least for the day. At least for the day you're a Giant. Even the well-known players on the team, for example, Red Ames did play a significant 17-year career in the major leagues. Excuse me. But even here, there are some mysteries. So, for example, he grew up in Warren, Ohio. He was a high school ball player in Warren, Ohio. He moved back to Warren, Ohio after his playing career and died in Warren, Ohio. And so it's reasonable to assume that he was probably born in Warren, Ohio. Well, after I published my bio of Red Ames in Deadball Stars, I got an email from a member of the Ames family who said, well, as far as we can tell, he wasn't born in Ohio at all, and put me onto the census records, which indicated that Red Ames and his parents were both born in Pennsylvania. Now, I haven't been able to narrow it down any further than that, but it's an intriguing, does it matter? Well, yeah, there's probably some significance to that. The family member wasn't able to pinpoint the place of birth any more than I was. But it's one of those things. Eventually, hopefully somebody will find it. But what I find intriguing about, anyway, these are just some of the things I find intriguing about baseball research, because given as much information as we have about baseball and about the players who played it and about the business surrounding baseball, it's just amazing to me how much is still out there, or how many stories that we have heard over the years that either turn out to not be so, or turn out to be strangely surprising, even if they are so. I wrote this up for the Dead Ball Era Committee in more detail, but Larry Doyle, who was probably one, again, along with Myers, but Doyle was also an intriguing player. He was the team captain and is best known, if he's known for anything today, it's for having once said, "It's great to be young in the New York Giant." And the guy who wrote this bio says that he said it's great to be young in New York and a New York Giant to Damon Runyon in 1911. And the guy who wrote this article was asked, well, what can you nail that down a little bit? Can you tell me when in 1911 Runyon wrote this? And that was me. I wrote the article, and I'm like, oh, I'll go back into my notes. This is embarrassing because I go back into my notes and I can't find anything in them that would have led me to write this sentence. I couldn't find, I found plenty of quotes of Doyle saying it's great to be young and a giant, but most of them were either attributed to him later in his year. I couldn't find anything where he said it at the moment, and certainly not necessarily to Damon Runyon. Well, I went back as part of the research on this. One of the things I did was go back through Damon Runyon's entire run of articles that he wrote covering the Giants in 1911, and partly just because it's great writing and I wanted to have it in there, but also partly to try to run this down. When did Doyle say this to Runyon? No idea. I couldn't find it. So this would be no big deal, except that several people have quoted my article about Doyle, and they've referred to this and have used me as the source, and I feel really bad about having led people astray, because frankly I have no idea where I got this information, and it's sloppy research on my part. I don't know, but it's a little bit embarrassing. So this got me wondering, did Doyle say it's great to be young and a giant? And if so, when and to whom did he say it? So the earliest reference I could find was the one here from 1915. Some writer once credited Larry Doyle with saying it is great to be young and a giant. Now, newspapers.com is not complete, but it's pretty cool. And I was able to find a lot of these things from newspapers.com, but I wasn't able to, but so far hadn't found that particular smoking gun. But 1915, I thought, okay. Then I found two references from Haywood Brown in his columns, where he's basically saying that he thought Doyle said it during 1915. It's great to be young and a giant. It's an odd thing to say that in 1915, because that was the 1 year in John McGraw's whole managerial career that the Giants finished last for a full season that he had managed. They were the last place team in the National League. So I can't imagine it was that great to be young and a giant in 1915. But that's what Brown seemed to had remembered. I did find some earlier allusions. So this one here about women being pledged into a mock sorority, and then another one where also involving sorority girls in Brainerd, Minnesota in 1910. So, it's great to be young and blank. So one of the things I wondered is, okay, was this just the 1909, 1910 equivalent of a meme? Was this just, maybe it was some popular quote at the time that just had gotten into the local lexicon, like keep on trucking or anything like that. Well, whoops, went the wrong direction. Well, then there's this article here from Hal Sheridan from Evansville, Indiana, and from 1915. And here we are. So he quotes, "It's great to be young and a giant. There, we've gone and done it, not because because it is great to be, etc., but because everyone else has quoted Jimmy Hopper's classic baseball line." Okay, so who is Jimmy Hopper? Well, James Hopper was a former college football player who had gone into writing and had made a name for himself as a fiction writer at the time. He had published a couple of collections of short stories. And he went on tour. He published this article, On Tour with the Giants, in 1908. And he was covering them while they were on their hot streak that got them into the position that they were in when in 1908, when eventually they had the classic end of the season confrontation with the Chicago Cubs. But this, he was covering them in a period during their Western swing, July, August. And he basically tagged along with the team. They sort of let him wear a uniform and sit on the bench. And they similar sort of to Charlie Faust, except without the bizarre antics. He was kind of their good luck charm for about a 7-game win streak. And then he had to file the article and presumably stop traveling with them, and they started losing again. So I suspect they were kind of thinking about that. They may have been thinking about this in 1911 when Faust was with them. It's like, this guy's nuts, but we can't get rid of him because we're winning. Let's not make, I wonder if any of them were thinking, let's not make the same mistake we made with Hopper 3 years ago. I have no idea. Maybe they did, maybe they didn't, but it's fun to speculate. But in any case, Hopper has this great line in that article where he's describing the New York Giants getting off a train. And I just absolutely love this. These Giants were young, and just very well dressed, et cetera, et cetera. One or two or three, and here he's talking about just trying to catch the eyes of the young women who are also at the train station. 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 of these Giants I noticed were a bit aware of the nattiness of their attire when they sauntered as it was with shoulders well back, with pivoting neck and roving eyes. Lucky rogues, seldom did they fail from some bit of gingham and ribbon and answering gleam, a second or two of lustrous long Lesch telegraphy. What it is to be young and a giant, me. We see these players in their uniforms, or we on the field, we read their story, read the box scores in the paper or whatever, but we don't often think about them as young men who are sort of in the situation where they can experience something that, how do I put it? I'm not sure. I had a great phrase and I lost it. Sorry, but it's a wonderful human moment, I thought, and something that I think we often don't think about when we tend to think of our baseball players as sort of cast in marble or something, and they weren't. They were young guys who were having a good time, basically. So is this what I'm looking for? Is this the earliest possible reference of "It's great to be young and a giant"? Did Hopper write this and Doyle started quoting it? Did Doyle say it and Hopper put it into his article? I don't think there's any way to know, but I think it is fair to say that it's great to be young and a giant. And I will open it up to questions.
RJ, I have a question and also a comment. I'll save the question for a second. Ruth Marquardt, in his later life, he met a woman from Baltimore, got married to her, and ended up working the $50 window at Pimlico. Mm-hmm. And he's buried in a Jewish cemetery in Baltimore. That's like a little addition to Ruth Marquardt. He was supposedly, his granddaughter lives in our development. Actually, the woman's granddaughter lives in our development. Says he was a fabulous dancer.
That's what I've read that, yeah.
Yeah. The question is, did the Giants play in 1911 in the Polo Grounds? Didn't it burn down?
Yes, it did.
And did they ever, was the World Series played there?
Yes, it was. They, fire was after the second game of the season in April, and they went on a tear to try to build a concrete and steel stadium as soon as they possibly could. They played their home games at Hilltop Park, which was where the Yankees were playing. And there was a little bit of scrambling at the beginning because they couldn't just they couldn't replace it with a wooden structure, which is what they had before. In large part because New York City was increasingly aware of the dangers of fires in wooden structures. And the interesting thing is that the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory tragedy had happened just 3 weeks earlier. So even though the Polo Grounds fire was at night when nobody was in the park, everyone was thinking, we can't let this happen. Suppose that had broken out while people had been in the park, we would have had a tragedy. So it had to be a concrete steel stadium. Brush was able to get the lease on the property from the Coogan family to build a concrete and steel stadium. So he didn't want to do that and then have the city put a road through it or something. Which happened a lot in those days. But he was able to get the necessary permissions to build that. So they constructed at a breakneck pace. They were ready. They were ready to play in it by June 28th. The Giants were back in the Polo Grounds on June 28th. Now the upper deck hadn't been finished, so you just had the ground deck. And there are some great stories in the papers of the time about how to keep cool when you're not covered by the upper deck, because one tip that I remembered was you take you get a glass of lemonade from the vendor, you drink the lemonade, you take the ice, put it in your handkerchief, put the handkerchief on your head, and put your hat on your head. So now you have this cold lump of ice on your head for as long as that lasts before it melts. In the days when we we don't often think about that in our air-conditioned world today of what that was like. There are also women wearing wide-brimmed hats at the time, and newspapers urging the guys who were sitting behind them to be chivalrous and don't kick about their view being blocked. But they eventually, of course, do get the second tier built, and then start even the pictures you can see sometimes of the 1911 World Series. There's still some bleachers that aren't quite completed and along the edges. They kept it going throughout the season, but they still weren't quite done by the end of the season. That was a long-winded answer to your question. Sorry.
Just explain why we see different kind of pictures of the Polo Grounds in that era, and it looks from one shot to another shot, it looked different.
That may be, yeah. I hadn't thought of that. I'll have to pay attention to that. Yeah, Mark, you mentioned Marquardt and his dancing ability. Yeah, he and Seeley did actually sing and dance on stage, and Seeley was the named performer at the time, but Marquardt apparently wasn't a bad singer, it turned out. Sadly, he tried to, after his, not even after his baseball days, but he tried to, after he and Seeley had divorced a few years later, he was trying to use his theatrical career as a bargaining chip to say, hey, I don't have to come back and play baseball. I'll just stay on Broadway or on vaudeville. And he tried to make a go of it without Seeley, and it didn't go that well.
You raised the question at the beginning, why did the players love McGraw in that era and rather than like in the 1920s? One of the things I remember reading about the Snodgrass era is obviously it cost the Giants the World Series. And the press went after him. Some of the writers went after him. And McGraw defended Snodgrass and said, I'm going to give this guy a raise in 2013. and he did give him a raise in 2013. So he really stuck by his players in that era. I don't know what happened in the 20s, but certainly in that era, he stuck by his players. And certainly that example is the Snodgrass era. And also Merkel back
Merkel,
in
too.
1908. He
Merkel,
stuck
too.
by Merkel.
Yeah, and there are lesser examples of that here and there too. There are examples of him defending Art Fletcher against criticism when Fletcher was having a rocky, not to the same famous degree, but yeah, if his players were hustling, if you were hustling, he was gonna back you. If you were making mental errors or not hustling, that was when he would get on you during this period. Now, what also strikes me as interesting is that, during this period, he was 38 years old when the 1911 season began. And again, it's one of those things where I always think of McGraw as this sort of pot-bellied, white-haired guy that we see in the later pictures, like 1933 All-Star game. That's always the picture I have of McGraw. But obviously, he, in this period, 1911, 12, 13, I think he's at the height of his powers as a manager, as a judge of talent, as a mentor. I think this is probably the high point of his career here. Yeah, he had, better success earlier and later, but I think this is some of his best work. And it's kind of interesting to see why. I'm still exploring that. Other thoughts?
Go ahead, Steve.
Hey, RJ, regarding the Marquard glide, how financially well did that do?
I would like to know that. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know how the sheet music sold or anything, or if Marquard ever saw any of that, because I suspect that went to the composers. But Marquard himself was getting like $1,000 a week for that particular tour. And the next year when he and Seeley toured again, I think they were as that time they were a unit, and I can't remember what, but probably comparable dollars. I did a presentation on the vaudeville, on baseball players in vaudeville at the Chicago conference. So not to repeat a lot of that, but that was a lot of money in those days. What was considered to be big time vaudeville was if you had a $300 a week bill, and that 300, which means you were putting $300 a week of talent on the bill for that week at your theater. And that's for everybody. A particular vaudeville bill might have anywhere from 8 to 10, 6 to 12, whatever, acts in it. And so dividing that 300 along, et cetera. So when Marquard or McGraw or Mathewson are getting $1,000 a week, that kind of tells you that for that, that was a lot of money in those days. So I suspect he was doing I suspect he and Blossom Seeley did pretty well out of that. But it would be interesting to know how well the sheet music sold. My stepdaughter and I were talking about the music industry evolution the other day because she's interested in this sort of thing. And that's one thing. In that period, obviously they didn't have records, they didn't have radio. Music sales were the sheet music. So, and they did keep track of that stuff about, but a bestseller was a song where the sheet music sold a lot of copies so that people could play it at home. So that would be interesting.
Go ahead, Tom.
2 points or questions. A month or so, I read a book on Honus Wagner, and I thought it was a biography of him. It was published in the 20s when he was a coach. But reading the whole book, it really was Honus's evaluation of all the players he played with and ranking the top players and all-stars and that. But the book started out, which impressed me, was he was really impressed by John McGraw. And he thought John McGraw was the greatest manager in baseball and the best. He learned more from, as an opponent of John McGraw than he did of anybody else. So that's just an observation. In your list of the other slide of giant players, there's a Frank Minush listed.
Yes,
Is that Heine Minush?
brother. There were 7 Manouche brothers who played some kind of professional ball, and Frank was a brother.
Was the older brother, younger brother? And
Older.
The nickname Heine, is that a reference to a German background or what?
I believe so. That was a common nickname for German players. So I assume that. I don't know a lot about Heine Manouche's career, but that would be my guess. But yeah, there's Heine Wagner, who played for Boston, shortstop, Heine Groh, Heine Sand. So yeah, that would probably be a good guess.
RJ got a question in the chat there.
Oh, yeah. I've been trying to find some contemporary accounts of that, and it seems like the contemporary accounts match up with a lot of the later accounts that you read in the McGraw and Robinson biographies. But here's one of the things that I suspect. Looping back to when we were talking about what's the difference between McGraw in 1911 and McGraw in, say, 1924 or later. And one of the things is that during this period, so McGraw had Robinson come out to spring training, for those of you who aren't familiar with this, but Robinson had businesses in the Baltimore area and didn't really want to leave those alone during the baseball season, but he went out to spring training and helped McGraw work with the pitchers. And during the 1911 season, McGraw wires Robinson and says, "Hey, the guys are kind of getting uptight and tired and so forth. Would you come here, help get them pepped up again?" Because they all liked Robinson. So he's like, sure. So Robinson shows up in 1911, loosens everybody up, gets everybody laughing again, and they go on that 19-4 tear. The next year, Robinson had done a great job helping Rube Marquardt establish himself as a major league pitcher. The next year, he does that with Jeff Tesreau. The year after that, it's Al Demery. And I think there may have been a little bit of resentment on the part of McGraw. And people have said this, but I think I think the evidence is there that it's true, that McGraw was feeling that Robinson was getting more credit than he was for some of those turnarounds. And the fallout came in the 1913 World Series, where Robinson had been coaching third base and made a poor decision, or the runner ignored the sign or something like that, but different accounts. But that cost the Giants a run and eventually the game. And so McGraw publicly blamed Robinson for that. That led to the two of them basically having an argument where I suspect a lot of history came out. I suspect the argument wasn't just about that one incident. I suspect it may have been about a pattern of things building up over time. It's one of those things that's hard to distinguish, figure out what really happened versus what people say it said 20 years later really happened. But I think that's probably I think there was some resentment on McGraw's part. I think there was some feelings on Robinson's part that, hey, I could do that. I could do what he's doing. If only I had a chance. And so Robinson did eventually get his own chance to manage. So, but that's, that's some of that speculation. So, but to loop back to my thought about what was unique about McGraw during this period. During this period, McGraw had Robinson. I mean, so McGraw could be bad cop and Robinson could be good cop, for example. He also had Mathewson, who, when he had the backing of Robinson, he had the backing of Mathewson, he had the backing of John Brush, who was the owner of the Giants until Brush's death at the end of 1912. 10 years later, he doesn't have anybody who can, he doesn't have anyone like Robinson or Mathewson or Brush who can take him aside and say, McGraw, you're being a jerk, knock it off, Nobody was going to be able to stand up to him like that. And I think that probably was McGraw's undoing later on. But while he had Robinson, who, while their friendship was strong and while Mathewson was there, and while Brush owned the team, he could be, he had people who could sort of believed in him and could let him do his thing, but who could also sort of keep him in check while he was, and from getting too out of control, which and to that extent, it's kind of sad that the McGraw-Robinson partnership didn't last longer, but it was probably inevitable that it wouldn't.
You raised the issue of Matheson and McGraw, which is an intriguing relationship given the difference in their personalities. Mm-hmm. Let me ask you, you said that maybe Matheson had the wherewithal to tell McGraw he was acting badly or something of that nature. Is that just anecdotal, or do you have any evidence that Matheson would actually stand up to McGraw on occasion?
I don't have any evidence of that. That's conjecture on my part, but I strongly suspect. I mean, the two of them had a very good relationship. Their wives were best friends for their whole lives, and I suspect that there was probably some diplomacy either out of the public eye that happened, or perhaps Christie talked to Jane, who talked to Blanche, who talked to John. I could see something like that happening. Did it happen? I don't have any direct evidence of it, but if I'm looking for things to account for the shift in McGraw's personality over time, I think that's one of the things I would think about.
You had a wonderful relationship, though. I mean, the way McGraw tried to help Matheson out later and still kept in touch with him when he was suffering from tuberculosis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and what an odd couple.
Hey, RJ, did McGraw's age have anything to do with the fact that because he was so young as a manager, did that have anything to do with the fact he had that kind of relationship with the players versus maybe later on in his career when you mentioned about Bob O'Farrell when McGraw was into his 50s and he was a little further away age-wise from his players? And the other question I would have is, you mentioned about Robinson, McGraw and Robinson's having that connection back to his Baltimore days when they were playing professionally together. Were there any other Baltimore connections that McGraw utilized while he was managing with the Giants?
The second question first. Sadie McMahon, who was a pitcher with the Orioles, was one of his scouts. And he had a good relationship with Jack Dunn, although not... I think that comes out a little later when he gets Jesse Barnes, so he did have the Baltimore connections, and those did come up. I don't think to the extent that I feel like who was it? Connie Mack probably had a better connection to Baltimore than McGraw did for whatever reason, McGraw being from Baltimore. And it's hard to believe, but somehow I get the sense that Mac worked his network a little better in that area. McGraw's age, yeah. So certainly as he got older, that's certainly a factor. And I think we've seen that in baseball history throughout as managers get older and further removed from their playing days, they tend to lose touch with the players. Early on, McGraw, of course, by this time had been managing for over a decade, and he, when he was really young, and his first managerial experience was, I'm not sure of the year, but I want to say 1899 when there was the syndicate. Yeah, I think it was 1899. There's the syndicate ownership of Baltimore and Brooklyn, and all the good players ended up getting shipped over to Brooklyn, and McGraw and Robinson were left with whatever was left. So I think that was, I think it was 1899. I'm stumbling over the year, but I think that's correct. But that was McGraw's first managerial experience, and obviously he was really, I mean, he was still playing at the time, and he was in his 20s at the time. As he moves along a little, so 1904, 1905, when he's winning the pennants with the Giants in the National League, he's still playing. He's not playing anymore, except maybe a game here and there. But he's still managing a team that's players that were either his contemporaries, guys like Bill Dallin, who had played against him in the 1890s. So they were still contemporaries. By the time you get into this period, the 1911, 1912, 1913, the players are not, other than sort of the old farts like Red Ames, who's been with them since that period and so forth, nobody's calling him Mac anymore. It's Mr. McGraw, right? And the younger players by now, but he's not so out of touch with them as he would be later. It's kind of a sweet spot, if you will. He can relate to the player, but he's still got enough gravitas to command that level of respect that, I mean, I suspect if he had tried to discipline Bill Dallin the way he tried to discipline some of his players later, Dallin would have clocked him. So, that's, yeah, it's an interesting point. And I think there's that sweet spot where McGraw is able to make it work.
Anybody else? Questions, comments for RJ, for me, about upcoming events? Try to keep you guys informed. Those of you who use Facebook, I'm going to start putting the events on there and the links to the Zoom briefed event. So if you miss it in an email, check there. Anybody else?
Thank you for the opportunity. This was fun.
Thank you, RJ. I'm glad to oblige. How's the chapter up there in Harrisburg doing?
I need to get a meeting together at some point. We had a Zoom meeting in the fall, but I need to get something here.
Okay. So you guys are always welcome here.
Oh,
we try to have 2 or 3 a month, and we will be having the national convention when it actually is held in person, and nobody knows exactly when that is. So since there's been no formal announcement outside of Phoenix, I've only heard what you've probably heard. So we're all waiting for official confirmation, whether it's this year or 2022 or whatnot. So our next thing is, don't forget, it's not the 17th. So our called shot lunch will be the 24th of February from noon to 2. So if you guys
we'll get links to that Babe Ruth Bash thing too.
Yeah, that should be starting that'll be that week as well. It should be the 23rd to the 25th.
Yeah, I got the notes of that, but we didn't get the links yet though.
Now, I'm going to get an official thing from Katie at the museum in the next day or so. And actually SABR HQ is going to blast it out as well. So hopefully people throughout the country will be able to tune in for some of the baseball stuff. So, I have my hands in a lot of things, but I'm not at the top level of any of them. So sometimes I get information just like you guys do.
I'm always afraid of I'll get the announcement, but not the link. That's
Right. I do my best to make sure you get the links. And for those of you who have, could always text me and be like, stupid, please send us the link, and I'll fix it as soon as possible. So stay well. I heard there might be more snow coming on Sunday. Depending on where you are, some people got it, some people didn't. I'm from the Scranton area. My mom got about 14 inches the last time I checked. So.
Well, Peter, if you heard anything about the Orioles season this year, whether they're going to have, well, obviously they're going to play games, and who knows how many, or whether they'll allow fans in the stands. I look at the schedule and I see the Indians come into Baltimore the first weekend of June. I think it's a long shot whether they'll allow fans in the stands, but if they do, I'll probably try to see if we can get together a Cleveland Club group to come. But no word yet on what's going to happen.
No, first of all, a lot of the people who got laid off and furloughed from MLB teams are still out. So they're doing things with a skeletal staff and remote. From what my contacts have talked about, and obviously, I'm involved with the designated hitters, they're thinking maybe Memorial Day weekend before fans come, and then it'll be limited. And of course, those of us who have season plans, how does that impact us, and how do you spread out, and what sections do you get if you can't have your normal seats, and all that kind of logistical nightmare stuff. So I wouldn't expect an opening day until at least mid to late May. So.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. And I can tell you from being the person who lives downtown and a mile from the ballpark, like traffic downtown is ridiculously slow. There's a lot of restaurants that have closed, things like that. So it's going to take a while for everything to revitalize. The Holiday Inn hotel even closed on Lombard Street. That's blocked from the ballpark.
permanently.
Yeah.
Really? Wow.
It's going to be another hotel, but it's vacant.
Okay.
Yeah, it's vacant as of now.
Wow.
You guys know how to reach me if you need anything. Otherwise, I'll see you on the 24th. I'll send around the museum information when all the lineups and the times are finalized. And you can thank sponsors and donors and stuff for giving enough to it. People don't have to be charged. So museum will actually probably make a profit without charging individuals. So that's a good thing. RJ, thank you.
Thank you, RJ.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.
Guys, have a good night.
Thanks for having me.
See you in a couple of weeks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Hey, thanks. Thanks for everything.